From the outside, the Allied command structure in World War II appeared unified, disciplined, and purpose-driven. American and British forces fought under a shared flag, coordinated massive operations across continents, and ultimately defeated Nazi Germany together. But behind closed doors, that unity was far more fragile than wartime propaganda suggested. Nowhere was that tension more visible than in the relationship between American commanders and Britain's most famous Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. To the British public, Montgomery was the hero of El Alamein, the steady professional who restored Allied confidence after years of defeat. To many American generals, however, he became something else entirely: arrogant, dismissive, territorial, and increasingly intolerable. The roots of that hostility formed early. When American forces entered the war in North Africa in late 1942, they did so as junior partners in a coalition dominated by British experience. Britain had been fighting Germany for over 3 years. The United States was new, untested at the operational level, and still learning how to coordinate large-scale land warfare. Montgomery never let them forget it. From his first encounters with American officers, he treated U.S. formations as auxiliary forces rather than equals. His briefings were one-sided. His planning assumed British primacy. His language implied that American troops were useful but unreliable. To Montgomery, this was not arrogance, it was realism. To American commanders, it was condescension. Those early impressions hardened quickly during the Tunisia campaign. American forces suffered serious setbacks against experienced German units, most notably at Kasserine Pass. Montgomery interpreted these failures as confirmation of his assumptions. Instead of privately mentoring American leadership, he publicly emphasized British superiority and positioned himself as the indispensable commander holding the alliance together. This approach poisoned relationships almost immediately. American generals did not deny their early mistakes, but they bristled at the implication that British leadership alone was responsible for Allied success. Montgomery's refusal to acknowledge American adaptation and learning would become a recurring source of resentment. What made the situation worse was Montgomery's approach to credit. He believed deeply in the importance of narrative control. Victories had to be framed correctly, and in his view, correctly meant through his leadership. Time and again, Montgomery emphasized his role in Allied successes while minimizing or ignoring American contributions. Press conferences, official statements, and post-battle reports consistently placed him at the center of events. For American commanders who were risking their reputations and their men, this was not a minor issue. Recognition mattered, not for ego alone, but for political standing, career advancement, and national pride. Montgomery's habit of claiming the spotlight created bitterness that extended far beyond individual personalities. By the time the war shifted to Sicily and Italy, the alliance was already strained. American commanders had grown more confident, more capable, and less willing to accept British dominance. Montgomery, meanwhile, showed little interest in adjusting his behavior. He continued to issue directives as if the coalition were an extension of the British Army. Strategic disagreements became personal. Operational debates turned into ideological clashes over who truly understood modern warfare. These tensions did not remain abstract. They influenced planning timelines, command decisions, and the willingness of leaders to cooperate fully with one another. It is important to understand that American hostility toward Montgomery was not rooted in jealousy of his success. Many U.S. officers respected his tactical abilities. They acknowledged his discipline, his attention to detail, and his ability to prepare forces for battle. What they struggled to tolerate was his inability to function as a coalition commander. Montgomery expected deference, not dialogue. He believed unity meant alignment with his vision. For an alliance built on shared sacrifice between sovereign nations, that attitude proved corrosive. By 1944, these unresolved tensions would explode into open conflict during some of the most critical moments of the war. The battles were still being fought against Germany, but a quieter struggle was unfolding at the highest levels of Allied command. It was a struggle over authority, recognition, and respect, and it would leave scars that lasted long after the guns fell silent. The North African campaign was supposed to be a proving ground for the Allied coalition. Instead, it became the place where mutual suspicion hardened into lasting resentment. After the American defeat at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, British leadership, Montgomery included, saw confirmation of what they already believed, that American forces were brave but inexperienced, and that firm British control was necessary to prevent disaster. Montgomery did not hide this view. In meetings, briefings, and correspondence, he spoke of American units as formations that needed to be handled carefully, guided firmly, and kept within strict operational limits. What he failed to grasp was how quickly the American command structure was adapting. The U.S. Army learned aggressively from failure, replacing ineffective commanders, revising doctrine, and integrating combined arms tactics at a pace that surprised even German observers. Montgomery, however, continued to frame American improvement as a byproduct of British oversight rather than American initiative. This attitude was deeply offensive to senior U.S. officers. Figures like George S. Patton, who took over Second Corps after Kasserine, transformed American battlefield performance within weeks. Discipline was enforced, training intensified, and confidence restored. Yet Montgomery rarely acknowledged these changes publicly. When Allied forces began to gain momentum in Tunisia, Montgomery positioned his British Eighth Army as the decisive element while portraying American advances as supportive rather than central. To American commanders, this was not merely a difference of interpretation, it was a denial of reality. Their troops were fighting, bleeding, and winning battles, yet remained second-class partners in Montgomery's narrative of the war. The resentment intensified because Montgomery's behavior contrasted sharply with that of other British commanders. Some were cautious, others aloof, but few were as openly dismissive of American equality. Montgomery's manner suggested not just seniority, but superiority. He expected American generals to accept his timelines, his priorities, and his command style without negotiation. When disagreements arose, he treated them as evidence of American immaturity rather than legitimate strategic debate. This was particularly damaging in a coalition where trust depended on mutual respect. American officers did not expect praise. They expected acknowledgement of parity. Montgomery offered neither. As the campaign moved into Sicily in mid-1943, these tensions became more visible. Planning for the invasion exposed fundamental differences in operational philosophy. Montgomery favored narrow, tightly controlled advances designed to minimize risk. American commanders preferred broader, more aggressive maneuver designed to exploit opportunity. These differences could have been reconciled through compromise. Instead, Montgomery insisted on reshaping the invasion plan to suit his preferences, forcing significant changes that limited American freedom of action. When those restrictions produced uneven results, Montgomery was quick to point to American overreach as the cause, even when his own constraints contributed directly to the outcome. For American commanders, this pattern became impossible to ignore. Montgomery demanded authority without accepting responsibility for coalition morale. He spoke of unity while undermining partnership. Officers such as Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the necessity of keeping the alliance intact, but they increasingly viewed Montgomery as a liability rather than an asset in that effort. Eisenhower, in particular, was forced into the role of mediator, smoothing over disputes, tempering Montgomery's statements, and preventing personal animosity from spilling into operational paralysis. That this mediation was necessary at all spoke volumes about how deeply trust had eroded. By the end of the North African and Sicilian campaigns, the American view of Montgomery had crystallized. He was respected as a planner and tactician, but distrusted as a partner. His refusal to adapt his leadership style to a coalition environment convinced many U.S. generals that he neither understood nor valued American contributions. What began as irritation turned into enduring dislike. The Americans did not hate Montgomery because he was British, nor because he was successful. They disliked him because time and again he treated them as subordinates in a war that demanded equals. These early fractures would not heal with time. Instead, they would deepen as the stakes grew higher and the operations more complex. By the time Allied forces returned to Western Europe in 1944, the relationship between Montgomery and American command was already strained to the breaking point. And when pressure mounted during the war's most critical moments, those unresolved tensions would explode into open confrontation. The Allied invasion of Normandy should have been the moment when coalition tensions eased. The landings succeeded, the beachheads held, and Germany's Western Front was finally breached. Instead, Normandy became the stage on which American frustration with Bernard Montgomery reached a new level. As commander of all Allied ground forces during the initial phase of the invasion, Montgomery exercised broad authority, but his use of that authority quickly alienated his American counterparts. From the first days after D-Day, Montgomery framed the campaign as the execution of a master plan that he alone had designed. He described the slow, grinding battle in Normandy as intentional, portraying American operations on the western flank as supporting actions meant to draw German forces away from his decisive thrust in the east. To American commanders fighting costly battles in the bocage, this narrative felt detached from reality. The issue was not merely interpretation, but public messaging. Montgomery repeatedly claimed that the Normandy campaign was unfolding exactly as he had intended, even as American forces bore the brunt of some of the heaviest fighting. When breakthroughs occurred, particularly during Operation Cobra, Montgomery was reluctant to acknowledge American operational initiative. Instead, he presented these successes as outcomes made possible by his overall strategy. For generals like Omar Bradley, this was infuriating. Bradley's forces had taken enormous casualties to break through German lines, adapting tactics rapidly under brutal conditions. Yet Montgomery's statements minimized that effort, reinforcing the perception that he viewed American armies as tools rather than partners. The tension escalated as Allied forces began racing across France. American units advanced rapidly, exploiting German collapse with speed and aggression. This momentum challenged Montgomery's preference for deliberate, tightly controlled operations. He argued repeatedly for a single, narrow thrust into Germany under his command, believing dispersion of forces risked failure. American commanders disagreed, favoring broad front advances that maximized pressure and exploited logistical strength. This disagreement was not theoretical. It shaped supply allocation, operational priorities, and command relationships. Montgomery's insistence on primacy increasingly appeared self-serving to American eyes, especially as U.S. forces now clearly constituted the majority of Allied combat power in Western Europe. Personality amplified these strategic disputes. Montgomery communicated certainty where Americans expected collaboration. He issued directives rather than proposals. He interpreted disagreement as insubordination. For a generation of U.S. officers raised in a culture that valued initiative and debate, this approach felt not just authoritarian, but dismissive. Generals like George S. Patton openly clashed with Montgomery, viewing his caution as obstruction and his manner as intolerable. While Eisenhower worked tirelessly to keep personalities from derailing operations, the strain was constant. Montgomery did not merely test American patience, he exhausted it. These tensions reached their peak during Operation Market Garden. Montgomery's ambitious airborne thrust into the Netherlands was intended to deliver a decisive blow by crossing the Rhine and ending the war quickly. He demanded priority for supplies and support, arguing that success would justify the concentration of resources. When the operation failed, resulting in heavy casualties and strategic setback, American frustration hardened into something more permanent. Montgomery accepted little responsibility publicly, emphasizing unforeseen difficulties and maintaining that the concept itself had been sound. To American commanders, this confirmed their worst suspicions. Montgomery was willing to claim credit for success, but reluctant to accept accountability for failure. By late 1944, the relationship between Montgomery and American generals had fundamentally changed. What began as cultural friction had become deep personal dislike. They did not question his competence, but they no longer trusted his judgment in a coalition context. Montgomery's brilliance as a tactician was overshadowed by his inability to operate as a partner. In an alliance where cooperation was essential, that failure mattered as much as any battlefield decision. As the war entered its final, most dangerous phase, these unresolved tensions would be tested under the greatest pressure yet, and when Germany launched its last major offensive in the Ardennes, the fragile unity of Allied command would be pushed to the brink. The German offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944 placed unprecedented strain on Allied command relationships. As German forces broke through American lines, creating what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, confusion and urgency dominated the early days of the crisis. In response to the rapidly shifting situation, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower made a controversial but practical decision. He temporarily placed the northern sector of the American front under Bernard Montgomery's control to stabilize the situation. Militarily, the move made sense. Politically and emotionally, it was explosive. Many American generals already viewed Montgomery with deep suspicion, and now they were expected to accept his authority at the most critical moment of the war. Montgomery did little to ease those concerns. Instead of acting as a caretaker commander during an emergency, he behaved as though he had been vindicated all along. Montgomery quickly reorganized defenses, a move that many historians agree helped stabilize the northern shoulder of the Bulge. However, his subsequent behavior turned a necessary command adjustment into a lasting grievance. At a press conference on January 7, 1945, Montgomery publicly framed the Allied response as a victory of his leadership, implying that American forces had been saved by British command intervention. He described the situation as chaotic before his arrival and orderly afterward, a narrative that infuriated American commanders who had been fighting, regrouping, and counterattacking continuously throughout the crisis. Generals, such as Omar Bradley, saw Montgomery's remarks as a deliberate attempt to rewrite events in his favor. To them, it was not merely poor judgment, but a personal betrayal during a moment of shared danger. The damage from Montgomery's comments was immediate and severe. American officers interpreted his statements as an accusation of incompetence and a dismissal of their sacrifices. George S. Patton, whose Third Army executed one of the war's most remarkable operational maneuvers by pivoting north to relieve Bastogne, was particularly incensed. Patton believed Montgomery had taken credit for a victory he had not earned and minimized American contributions that were central to the outcome. Eisenhower was forced into damage control once again, privately rebuking Montgomery and publicly reaffirming American leadership. But the trust that had been strained for years finally snapped. After the Bulge, many American generals no longer concealed their dislike. Montgomery was no longer seen as difficult. He was seen as dangerous to Allied unity. From this point onward, Montgomery's influence steadily declined. Eisenhower curtailed his authority, limiting his role to operational command rather than strategic direction. American generals worked around him rather than with him. While Montgomery continued to command large forces effectively, he was increasingly isolated within the Allied leadership. His insistence on public self-justification had cost him political capital he could not recover. Even British officials privately acknowledged that his behavior had damaged relations with the Americans at a moment when unity mattered most. The Battle of the Bulge crystallized every complaint American commanders had raised since North Africa. Montgomery's inability to share credit, his tone of superiority, and his disregard for coalition sensitivities were no longer abstract irritations. They had become liabilities with real strategic consequences. The irony was stark. Montgomery's tactical competence during the crisis was genuine, yet his handling of its aftermath undid much of the goodwill his actions might have earned. In a war where cooperation between equals was essential, Montgomery repeatedly acted as though respect could be commanded rather than earned. By early 1945, American generals had reached a settled conclusion. Montgomery was a capable battlefield commander, but an unfit coalition leader. Their dislike was no longer emotional, it was professional. They did not trust him to place alliance stability above personal reputation. That judgment would shape how Montgomery was treated during the war's final months and how his legacy would be debated long after Germany surrendered. The alliance would hold together long enough to win, but the scars left by the Bulge would never fully heal. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the military alliance that had held together under pressure dissolved almost overnight. What remained were memories, memoirs, and sharply divided interpretations of leadership. Nowhere was this divide clearer than in how Bernard Montgomery was remembered. In Britain, Montgomery emerged as a national hero. His victory at El Alamein, his emphasis on preparation, and his refusal to waste lives fit neatly into a narrative of disciplined British professionalism. In the United States, however, many senior commanders remembered him very differently. To them, Montgomery was not the man who saved the alliance, but the man who constantly strained it. This divergence was not the result of post-war rivalry. It reflected experiences lived in real time, under the highest stakes imaginable. American generals were capable of respecting Montgomery's battlefield skills while rejecting his leadership style. They acknowledged his strengths, his methodical planning, his insistence on morale, and his ability to prepare forces for set-piece battles. But they also concluded that those strengths came at a cost. Montgomery struggled to adapt once the balance of power within the alliance shifted. By 1944, American forces provided the majority of manpower, logistics, and operational momentum in Western Europe. Yet Montgomery continued to behave as if British leadership remained paramount. He demanded deference without offering reciprocity. For American commanders raised in a culture that prized initiative, accountability, and shared credit, this approach was unacceptable. Figures like Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the problem clearly. Eisenhower's genius was not tactical brilliance, but coalition management. He recognized that winning the war required balancing egos, national pride, and operational necessity. Montgomery repeatedly made that task harder. He spoke publicly when restraint was required. He framed events in ways that elevated himself at the expense of others. Even when his decisions were sound, his presentation alienated allies whose cooperation was essential. Eisenhower tolerated Montgomery because he had to, not because he trusted him. That distinction mattered. The American dislike of Montgomery was therefore not emotional in the shallow sense of personal animosity. It was professional judgment. U.S. commanders concluded that Montgomery could not be relied upon to subordinate personal reputation to alliance cohesion. In coalition warfare, that failure is not trivial. It can cost time, trust, and lives. Montgomery's inability to recognize this reality ensured that his relationships with American generals never recovered, even as the war moved toward victory. By the end, cooperation existed because structures enforced it, not because trust sustained it. This explains why Montgomery's legacy remains so contested. He was neither the flawless hero of British memory nor the caricatured egotist of some American accounts. He was a commander shaped by Britain's early war isolation, accustomed to unilateral authority, and slow to adjust to partnership on equal terms. The Americans, arriving later but adapting rapidly, expected recognition and respect commensurate with their growing contribution. Montgomery failed to meet that expectation. The result was not hatred born of envy, but resentment born of exclusion. In the broader view of history, this story reveals something essential about coalition warfare. Victory depends not only on defeating the enemy, but on managing allies. Tactical brilliance cannot compensate for diplomatic failure at the highest levels of command. Montgomery helped win battles. Eisenhower helped win the war. The tension between those roles defined Allied leadership in World War II and shaped how its commanders remembered one another long after the fighting ended. In the end, American generals did not hate Bernard Montgomery because he was British, cautious, or successful. They disliked him because time and again he failed to treat them as equals in a war that demanded equality. That failure did not prevent Allied victory, but it left a legacy of bitterness that outlasted the alliance itself. Understanding that legacy does not diminish Montgomery's achievements. It places them in their proper context and explains why one of Britain's greatest commanders became one of America's most controversial allies.